Welcome back to Acid Horizon. This is Craig. Today, we need to address something that cuts to the core of what we do, and that is our commitment to intellectual and political integrity. For almost 5 years, we have worked to cultivate a space where radical thought isn't just entertained, but acted upon. But what happens when the institutions that claim to support independent publishing instead move to silence and control the voices they platform? When financial interests and political expediency take precedence over the work of writers, thinkers, and communities striving for justice? We've had to make a decision, one that aligns with our principles, our work, and the people that we stand alongside. That's why, as of today, we are no longer working with Watkins Media, Repeater Books, Zero Books, until these imprints are in the stead of people who care about our causes. Please click any of the links at the top of the show notes to learn more and support us. Today on the show, we have returning guest Dr. Gregory Sadler, and we are talking about the ideas and the political evolution of Peter Thiel in Acid Horizon's own ongoing series, which covers the rise of the new right. Okay, let's listen. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Who is Peter Thiel? The kingpin of the so-called PayPal mafia, the co-founder and chairman of the data analytics monolith Palantir, and the alleged kingmaker of the new right. In his young adult life, Peter Thiel embraced libertarianism as his political philosophy through his involvement with the Stanford Review, a conservative libertarian publication he co-founded as a student. His early writings reveal a young man enthralled by free markets, minimal government intervention, and a techno-optimism that championed a political agenda centered on individual liberty. This vision was further reinforced by his early success in Silicon Valley, most notably as a co-founder of PayPal alongside figures like Elon Musk, where he helped pioneer online payment systems in a way that reflected his belief in decentralization and financial autonomy. However, by the time he wrote The Education of a Libertarian in 2009, partly the focus of today's discussion, we will see a Thiel who has grown deeply disillusioned with democracy, arguing that freedom and democracy are no longer compatible. In particular, Thiel observes that the expansion of suffrage in the 20th century coincided with the growth of the welfare state, implying that the very people to whom voting rights were extended ushered in an era of redistribution, complete with all the regulatory excesses he decries, and all the familiar dog whistles as well. In this essay, he advocates for alternative governance models, an escape from politics itself through the possibilities of cybernetic technologies, as well as a flirtation with seasteading, the idea of floating libertarian city-states free from government control. All in all, this marks a cynical turn towards an anti-politics, one that arguably set the stage for his later pivot into the revival of national conservatism. By 2016, a new Peter Thiel emerged, one intent on firmly aligning himself with the existing organs and traditional ideologies familiar to reactionary power in the West. He is remembered for his $1.25 million donation to Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign, a move that signaled his break from the libertarian skepticism of state power in favor of a vision of national sovereignty and Western chauvinism. This ideological shift is also reflected in his corporate ventures, most notably Palantir, the data analytics firm that has, in essence, realized his vision of an entity carrying the torch for American and Western supremacy. Through its deep entanglement with the CIA and U.S. military, Palantir has positioned itself at the forefront of artificial intelligence development and surveillance innovations, technologies that, rather than escaping the state, have fortified its power in unprecedented ways. And though we are talking about Peter Thiel today, we have somebody with us who we believe should be far more esteemed than that man, and that is Dr. Gregory Sadler, who we have back on the show, who we ordinarily have for discussions of things like Stoicism or Greek philosophy. But we thought, based on the success of our very first encounter with Greg, which was our episode about Nick Land, we would bring Greg back to talk about this figure who's very important in both American and global politics today. Greg, how are you doing?
I'm good. So you decided to roll the dice.
Exactly. So, Greg, can you just tell folks a little bit about yourself? I'm sure 80% of the people listening know who you are already, but in case they don't.
Sorry, who doesn't know who Dr. Greg Sadler is?
There's like three people. Yeah.
No, I'm sure there's plenty of people out there. We often make the distinction between being famous, and YouTube famous, and one is just a facsimile of the other. So yeah, I'm a, what would you call it? A half academic. I still have one foot in traditional academia, but I've been doing a lot of philosophy outside of the academy and in a variety of ways, some of which qualifies as public philosophy. Some is like working with businesses or organizations or private clients. And yeah, that's probably enough, I think, right?
Yeah, great. And we also, of course, have Adam and Will in-house with us today. And we took a look at this essay, The Education of a Libertarian, which Thiel had written in 2009, which you can find on the Cato Institute's website. And, after having done a deep dive now on Peter Thiel, I'm actually glad that we did this essay, but realized very quickly that this was so out of date compared to Peter Thiel's views and activity in the world today. But I think this is a good starting point. And I think also what I'd like to bring to the discussion, and I, of course, want to hear everybody's opinions here, is that, how does somebody go from this kind of classic and classical position of the American libertarian, which might be a somewhat unique position, even in the milieu of Western politics, and how one goes from this particular position to the kind of sovereignty that Thiel espouses today, in the context of the new right, and also how it might attend to this early sentiment that he maintained about an anti-politics. I have my own theory about this, but I'm curious what others think. But Greg, we'll start with you. What were your initial impressions of this essay, or maybe just Peter Thiel in general?
Well, I'm not a fan of him. I mean, I come to this essay having seen the stuff that he's been involved with for, the last decade or so. I guess I kind of didn't pay that much attention to him around the time of this essay. He was just one of many people involved with a political philosophy that I think is curious, but usually not consistent. And, we could talk about what happened to the libertarian movement. That's a whole other interesting, fascinating thing, why it is that they all basically are now Magas, which would seem to go against what they're doing. And I just kind of saw him as somebody who had plenty of money and access and some half-baked ideas. And I'll talk about why I use that kind of flippant term in just a bit. So, reading this, you're right, it is kind of out of date, but the idea of, I think in that essay, he talks about the need to go beyond politics, but you still have to have politics. In other places, he uses similar language about the political can't solve our problems, right? But it's, you can't ever get away from the political in the broad sense, because you're always monkeying around with society and playing around with incentives and disincentives. And, will the government regulate something? Won't it? People are always paying money into the coffers of various governmental agents and hoping it'll buy them influence. And Thiel is, no exception to that. So it seems disingenuous to talk about, unless you're actually going to do something like, I don't know, like a McIntyrean move. And I mean a proper McIntyre, not the bastardization that happens with, like, people on the right trying to co-opt him, where you're like, listen, things are messed up. We can't really achieve what we need to. We still have to be involved in politics, but we gotta create something beyond it. I mean, Thiel is saying, okay, he talks about the three things here: cyberspace. Okay, yeah, that's something we're all familiar with, right? Outer space, yeah, we're not getting there anytime soon. We're not going to colonize Mars in our lifetime. The author of the Mars trilogy, who did a lot of research on this, and his books, Kim Stanley Robinson's, red Mars, blue Mars, green Mars, he projects like about a 500-year time frame for that. And he was interviewed, and he was doing that based on good science. He was interviewed later on, and he was like, no, totally optimistic. It's going to take, millennia to colonize a planet like Mars. It just ain't going to happen. So that seems like kind of a non-starter. I mean, unless Thiel means like we're going to have stuff on the moon, which seems to me even tougher. And then the seasteading idea. I mean, I think some people have tried that, and you very quickly run into all these massive problems. I mean, you'd almost be better off, instead of trying to seastead, buying private islands and doing your libertarian utopian things there, rather than trying to build something that's going to just float around. So a lot of this strikes me as kind of, on the one hand, it could be interpreted as like pie in the sky, typical pipe dream libertarian stuff, or it could be interpreted as, this is what this early stage of his career looked like, and then he realized, this isn't going to work. I need to go all in on the power structures that are available.
Yeah, I mean, I think this essay, I will disagree a little bit. I don't think this essay is quite out of date, only to the extent that I think you do see this in a lot of the ways other Palantir sort of acolytes have. So there was talks of, for example, of this thing Prospera in an island off South America. They have moved exactly that, Greg, to small islands, and even having some plans for Greenland of all places. I mean, this is partly because Thiel has made the biggest campaign contribution to a single candidate in American political history, and that was the $14 million he gave in support of J.D. Vance's campaign, eventually to make him vice president. And I think this essay it's out of date to the extent that he's moved beyond it, but it's kind of like in the Hegel sense of being out of date, in that it's the seed, and that we're now seeing the kind of the flower. It sort of both negates the seed, but that's also part of the way in which it changes by developing itself in these ideas. Because I mean, if he had, I mean, he's still naming his companies after fucking Lord of the Rings. No shame to Lord of the Rings, but he's still very much in this mode. And you see him talking recently as well about Russian cosmism, which is just essentially this idea. And I don't want to be too flippant about it, but this is really the nuts and bolts of it. Is we're going to colonize space, and anything we do is to do with this idea of a common task of defeating death. And we can kill whoever we want to defeat death, because eventually death's going to be defeated. And you can see this when he talks about, the first paragraph. He says he stands against the, quote, the ideology of the inevitability of the death of every individual. And I find it so interesting there that it's basically this kind of, it's a libertarianism in the most sort of negative sense. Because when I'm thinking about libertarianism, my introduction to the ideology, and I know this hasn't been the most popular version of it, is John Rawls. Not John Rawls, sorry. The guy they put against John Rawls, Robert Nozick. And Robert Nozick's whole thing is he's basically a Kantian. He's basically maximizing the defense of moral rights. Control F rights on the education of a libertarian. It shows up, the word right shows once in the postscript when he has to clarify what he means when he says that women getting the vote was a bad thing. The framework of right is so absent in this discourse, because it's more just like a leave me alone thing. Don't make things political in that sort of rudimentary sense. When people say, don't put black people in Star Wars, there's not really a theory of politics. It's really interesting we're getting more out of Thiel for what he's not saying, in the sense what he's circling around, what questions he's avoiding confronting when he puts himself forward as a thinker who has had an education as a libertarian. And that's exactly what's not showing up here.
Yeah, other important libertarian thinkers really do stress rights as well. And I kind of think one of the reasons why you're not seeing so much of that until, well, actually, I think there's two reasons. So one is going to be a completely cynical speculation on my part. So I'll get that out of the way right away. I mean, I get the sense that with people like Thiel, who I think we can call oligarchs, I think it's a perfectly fine term to apply to them. They're all for freedom. They're all for rights. They're all for that sort of stuff, just not for everybody else. They want that for themselves. They don't want to use that rhetoric, because then other people might get uppity and think that they also should have that sort of thing. No, that's a plausible conjecture. But, we were talking before we got started about another piece that he wrote called The Straussian Moment, which got a lot of traction. And in it, part of what he's doing, he's endorsing to some degree Leo Strauss and his acolytes and René Girard and people like that, Pierre Monnet. And I think he misinterprets all three of them. But I think that what's common to them, he actually also brings up Spengler in that essay as well, is that all of them have this shtick that modernity has gone too much in on liberalism, broadly speaking, which is focused on rights. And even the conservatives aren't really conservative in a real sense. They're not like trying to get us back to before the French Revolution. That kind of conservatism is gone. So, what we need is something that would go beyond this, a deeper analysis. And there, McIntyre says something similar, but McIntyre actually has like a cogent way of articulating this, whereas I don't think that Strauss does. Girard, okay, there's some stuff that could be said there. Certainly his appropriation of Girard doesn't get that across. And so I think that might be one reason why you're not seeing the usual. You're right. Libertarians are usually all about protecting rights. It's all about negative liberty and don't tread on my stuff. John Hospers is another person who, was pretty important, not just in the theory, but also in the American Libertarian Party. And for him, it's all about basic rights, So why doesn't Thiel have that? I don't know. It could be that he's buying into this history of ideas, and it could be that he just doesn't want to share rights with anybody.
I mean, rights are quite a recent invention. Even going back, not to go back as far as Hegel, but even just the idea of right itself was never quite as divided into rights in this individual sense, maybe.
Well, I mean, in that essay, again, John Locke is one of the bad guys. Which is interesting because a lot of libertarians really love Locke, right? But if you're tracing it back further, you can be like, yeah, this is one of the places where liberalism, not in the contemporary sense, but in the broader sense, this is how it snuck in, And so the American founders were too captivated by that sort of point of view.
Yeah, I gotta interject because you name checked Hegel, but I think that one of the things that's missing, and this is the problem with continental philosophy trying to understand this stuff, is it forgets that in fact the discourse on these issues is much more defined by Voltaire, Locke, and Rousseau than it ever was by the German tradition moving from the cosmopolitan Kantianism to Hegel. Kant, very famously has a bust of Rousseau as he's still alive, in his home. And one of the problems with trying to understand the figures that are being promoted and then betrayed as this sort of weird Whig historicism is thrown up and then abandoned by libertarianism is that the notion of rights and right as it existed in this one tradition on the side of Kant, Hegel, and so on is kind of alien to the notion that as it existed on the individual side with Hobbes, George Lawson, Locke, Pufendorf. The thing that's so fascinating about Thiel is not just his vastness of citations, which I think some of it we can just throw up as billionaire dilettantism, he's going to cite Brecht at the end of his essay on Strauss, and he's going to name check Milton Friedman. But what's so fascinating to me is that the kind of libertarian that Peter Thiel is a libertarian as it pertains to the maximization of a particular kind of power imminent to particular kinds of men in humanity. So Adam isolates the cosmists, right? So Nikolai Fedorov, The Common Task, Spaceship Humanity, all of these things that were really, really influential. But if we look very closely in the text that we read for today, which is The Education of a Libertarian, and we cross-reference it to the Straussian moment, so there are two kind of moments where things go bad. There's the liberal turn with figures like Rousseau, Locke, Voltaire, etc. But then there's this other turn, which is the 1920s, when the political system has to shift away from robber baron capitalism because it's reached its limit. There needs to be a liberal intervention into the market in order to save it from a complete imminent collapse. And what Peter Thiel truly believes is that, no, if you actually just completed that really material wealth transfer, like if you really let it happen, if you sort of let this eugenic kind of shift, if you let the poor starve, if you just let the market regulate itself, Spaceship Earth would become popular. And popular in the sense that all people would be forced into it. It would have the entire population behind it. And that's the kind of libertarianism that he's looking for. The libertarianism where, beneath Locke, the Locke where it's no longer a question of interests, but your ability to acquire those interests within the state of nature. Think, for example, of like Locke's justification of enslavement, where his argument in the second treatise is basically you've given up in the state of nature your ability to seek out what you desire. And therefore, in civil society, it would become logically impossible. It's not a great argument, right? It's a very flawed one, but this is the basis of Locke's logic. And I think that's where Peter Thiel is he's trying to cut underneath Locke. I don't know if he knows he's doing that, but he's finding like this ugly core in the history of liberalism in order to then promote this opposition to it.
I mean, it's a very strange kind of libertarianism that thinks that you can like totalize a buy-in to some sort of program like that, right? And you at a certain point you're like, okay, where does this cease being anything remotely like libertarianism and become something quite distinct and different? And coming back to one thing I do want to talk about is Thiel has bought into something that he saw working, and like you pointed out, he's effectively bought a vice president who, Trump's probably not going to be around forever. He's in terrible shape, clearly will decline, probably will have to either like be replaced or will die in office. And then this guy Vance turns out to be a great investment because he becomes the next president. Even if Trump makes it through, Vance will be the candidate for, the next run around. And we've got a Republican Party that is radically different than those of us who are older remember the party being like. Basically, anybody who's not a MAGA Republican has been, and who doesn't have some sort of like really protected position like Mitt Romney does by being, in Utah as a Latter-day Saint and being incredibly, wealthy and popular there, everybody's been purged. And they prize party unity above everything else. And they're also, seemingly obsessed with like doing anything they can to own the libs, whatever that means from week to week, And so I think Thiel saw the writing on the wall. And there's two ways you can go with being a libertarian. And he's not the only one who's gone this way. He's just gone this way in a different way than the other libertarians. You can either say, well, the Libertarian Party, it's not right, it's not left. We want legalization of marijuana and access to abortion, but we also want free markets and blah, blah, blah. The kind of libertarianism that existed through a lot of, the 70s, 80s, 90s. Well, that seems to be gone. I mean, there's still academic libertarians out there who I like follow on Twitter because some of them went to my alma mater, and I know them, but they have zero influence whatsoever on what there is of that party. And, we used to joke back in the day that libertarian just means that you call yourself a libertarian but vote Republican back before, it was the Tea Party morphed into MAGA and all that, because there was some truth to that then. The only states where Libertarian Party actually had much of a traction were Texas and Indiana, as far as I know. I mean, they're on the ballot in lots of places, but nobody votes for them. But now it's, if you're a libertarian and you call yourself a libertarian, odds are you are also a card-carrying member of MAGA. And you may not belong to the Republican Party, but you're going to support and vote and post in social media along with them. So I think that, somebody like Thiel, could he just be that weird, wacky libertarian way out on the fringes? No, because he wants to get things done. And he realized that to do that, you've got to make all these connections and buy people and collaborate essentially with the reigning ideology, whatever the hell MAGA is. I mean, it's changing from week to week.
I wanted to get your opinion, because you said that before we started the recording, you said that you'd taken a look at the Straussian moment. And there's this kind of strange racist moment. I mean, obviously that whole essay, because it circulates around securitarianism surrounding 9/11 and enjoying the wealth of the West. And we're at this moment. Like, I want to know what the West means for these folks, right? Because we're at this bizarre moment where, and I'm going to bring up some contemporary political issues. So if I do, and people are, I'm sorry, the West is kind of a contested notion among conservatives right now, among traditionalists, because Peter Thiel says in the Straussian moment, the non-Western world had not yet seen the Peace of Westphalia, a racist, subtle dog whistle about the kind of inherent violence coming from the non-Western world. But then when you talk about the West, you see a kind of strange detesting of the quote-unquote Whig historicism of figures like Locke, which we associate very strongly with the West, figures like Rousseau, if there is such a thing as the West. That's historically what it's meant in the United States, like in our high schools, when we talk about Western civilization, Western civil values, Hannah Arendt, all of those things, that's what it means. But they have a deep resentment for those kinds of quote unquote values, those kinds of forces of history. And I think it comes out very strongly in their quite forward support for figures like Vladimir Putin, who I don't think we could say is a figure of the West. Philosophers, that's such a loose term, like Alexander Dugin, who is, again, he's kind of a similar dilettante, but he's not a billionaire. He's like Rasputin. If we had dime store Rasputin, it would be Alexander Dugin. So I'm wondering, when you see the word the West in texts like this, and you see names like Schumpeter and all of these notions of innovation and progress, and where does that factor into a figure like Peter Thiel?
I guess there's a couple things to say about that. I mean, when I see people like that talking about the West, my bullshit alarm immediately goes off, because almost always it's some weird, wacky, almost like movie version of what they think the West is going to be. And they don't read enough to actually have much of a sense of, the ideas that comprise, let's just call it, if we want to stick with West, let's call it Western civilization and ideas and things like that. It's a very complicated, heterogeneous kind of thing where people are arguing with each other. So it's not like you can point at oh, here's Rousseau, there's the West, Well, yeah, but also Hume is that way too. And Hume, famously was one of the guys who even he couldn't put up with Rousseau, so the personality clashes. So I think when I see that term West, it's sort of like when I run into people who are advocating classic schools or classical education, I'm like, you guys don't know
great books.
Yeah, you don't know what you're talking about half the time. And if you actually took these great books seriously, just reading Plato would interrogate them and say, hey, you're a bunch of screw ups. You're a bunch of deviants. You clearly don't, you're not on the right track. But they don't take it seriously. It's like a fetish more than anything else, right? And it's sort of like terms that conservatives love to use. Like right now, for the last about 3 years, common sense gets used all the time by them. And it's almost like there's an idea in their head. It's super, super fuzzy, but they know it's good. And they know that the other people don't have that. So West, we're for the West. They're not the West. So I think that's part of what's in the background. I think that Thiel's suckered by that as well. I think he believes his own bullshit too much. I think it also serves a rhetorical purpose, which is to, you mentioned so in this case, the contrast is between Western civilization and Islamic civilization. And, one of the ideas that was very popular around that time that was being opposed to Fukuyama's views on, the end of history was Huntington's Clash of Civilizations.
Yeah, and this is kind of being written by René Girard, too, who was touring the United States around this time, giving lectures at Purdue. There was the René Girard camp. I don't know if they still do that, but I had a libertarian philosophy professor in my past who studied, with and studied René Girard. So I think all of us kind of have these weird kind of people but René Girard, one of the things that when he was giving these tours, and you can find them on Audible, they're free, his lectures, they're bizarre. I do want to give a bit of a warning, is that there's a fundamental ineffable difference between the quote unquote Islamic world and the quote unquote Christian world. And it comes down to the lack of a scapegoat, right? It always has to come back to some sort of.
That was one of his ideas that I think Girard is a great example of somebody who has some good ideas and goes too far with those ideas, So they're true up to the point where they cease being true.
And actually, let's pick up as well on the mention of Schumpeter as well, because Joseph Valois Schumpeter is one of the only Austrian economics I've actually spent any time with. That and a bit of Friedman. And what I think is interesting about Schumpeter as well, not only the idea of creative destruction, but Schumpeter was one of the only Austrian economists to actually take socialism seriously on its own terms. If anyone's read his book, Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, and eventually he says, socialism actually in many respects would probably be a lot better. But his argument for democracy essentially revolves around reframing it as a kind of a vote-based market. And this idea of seeing democracy as a kind of a corporate form of production is very much what's going to tie Peter Thiel as he develops into Yarvinism, into Curtis Yarvin, who believes that the government should be run like a corporation and democracy is, in a way, running governments for them. But they have basically essentially vulgar Marxist view of things to the extent that they think that democracy is a sham because we just have to, it's all just, liberal democracy is just corporate governance by another name. That's why they want to eliminate it, because it's inefficient, not because they think corporate governance is bad. But on top of that, one of the things I had to bring up as well, Greg, because you mentioned the split between libertarians and the Republican Party, is the very idea of the Republic. It feels like MAGA is republicanism without republicanism. In a way, it's the Republican Party without an idea of the res publica, a public thing. And this is why it's getting so tied up with these neo-monarchist ideologies.
I think there's something to that, certainly in the sense that, in its classic meaning, you look at political theory that use that, Cicero, for example, even going all the way, through to Hegel, right, in the philosophy of right. Every group has to have its seat at the table. It's not to say that everybody is exactly equal or anything like that. That's probably not going to work, but everybody's needs and interests need to be somehow taken into account. And of course, American history, we didn't manage that. De Tocqueville in his Democracy in America says, the two great sins of America are against the black race and the red race. And this is, if anything's going to bring them down, this is what's going to bring them down. So obviously it's never happened. Right. But we've had, wider and narrower stuff. So, the things that Thiel was talking about, women's suffrage. Oh, yeah, you let those women have a seat at the table. Oh, that's not a great thing, because then they take things in the wrong direction. It's better if we have more and more possibility for people to say, no, I don't see things your way. Let's actually talk this out. But I think that the current MAGA Republicans, I think one of the part of their mindset, they go back to the earlier, America First and Know Nothing Party and stuff like that. First use of the word Native American is to describe WASP Americans as opposed to those Irish and other people coming in. And I think that's really a big part of what's in their mind, is like they have been put upon by all these woke, or pick whatever, whatever the flavor of the day is, DEI people that have taken away their share, and they were the ones who are the representatives of real America, and everybody else, either they assimilate completely, learn English, become the way that they ought to be, follow the mores that they have, which they don't live up to. I mean, adultery is rife, in the people who complain about the sanctity of marriage. We could go on and on and on about different kinds of hypocrisy, but they've got this fixation that we are the real people and the republic should be us, and everybody else should be, guest workers or on their toes so they don't offend us, or pick, whatever else it happens to be. I think that's part of what's going on there. And it's easy for a guy like Thiel to glom onto that, because he's got tons of influence, tons of money, plenty of people around to, like, the proverbial blow smoke up his ass all day long and tell him that he's brilliant and all of that. So it's very easy for people like that to view themselves as being in, the real, I mean, in his case, not American so much, but the real Westerner,
I'd like to spark a little conversation about Thiel's anti-politics, and going back to this earlier version of Thiel as a libertarian. Clearly, I mean, I believe that the chauvinism that we see in Thiel today is operating in the background, maybe not even the background. It kind of pokes its head out in the middle of that essay. But just the cynicism that underlines everything that he writes there. For example, let's take some of it seriously anyway. And in doing this, I tried to find an analog in left-wing thought today that would echo at least some of the predicates about democracy that Thiel's putting forward. And within the past year, I encountered this thinker, actually thanks to Will, who is Massimo Cacciari. And he was an Italian autonomist whose views then evolved somewhat. I think he was the two-time mayor of Venice, if I'm not mistaken.
He was also blacklisted by Antonio Negri from the autonomous movement because he suggested people, like, with audacity, to read Heidegger. So the Marxists had to, like, hide him away.
Yeah. One of the things that's interesting about Cacciari's philosophy is that, and I just kind of squished everything down here. He believes that the state ultimately is a tragic entity. So imagine somebody who's an autonomous Marxist, somebody with anarchist leanings, who then recognizes, well, it doesn't seem like the state is going away. However, the thing that seems to have gone away is the eschatological vision of all of the big ideologies, everything from Marxism to Nazism to even liberalism. And I think that takes us to our present moment. I think a lot of people are looking at the present situation in the United States, where the two dominant wings of liberal capitalist ideology see the left wing of it at the moment as being completely shattered, as having really nothing to offer. The Kamala Harris campaign didn't really give us anything except an alternative to what we're experiencing now, at least in my view. But what Cacciari says that's very different than Peter Thiel is. Well, one more similarity is both Thiel and Cacciari believe that we shouldn't return to utopian politics. But unlike Thiel, who seems intent on escaping the whole domain of politics, which of course he does not, Cacciari believes that we need to stay with the trouble nonetheless, and that there's always going to be this incessant and ongoing agonism between entities within the context of governance and the state, and these things will never resolve. And so what we need to do is we need to internalize that ultimate lack of reconciliation. This agonism is going to persist nonetheless. And I have a lot of problems even with that idea. I'm just curious what you think, Greg, and then everybody else, about the idea of an anti-politics in this time. I mean, clearly, I think amongst most of us in the room, we don't believe in an anti-politics, but are we at a point where liberalism cannot recover? What is next? What do we do about the fragments and the bricolage that is now circulating in the political sphere? And what does the picture of the future look like against what we're facing now?
Okay, well, there's a couple things there. Let's think about the liberalism and the notion of liberal democracy first. There's a lot that you need to have in order for that to function. And a lot of people were theorizing about this post Cold War, and thinking about how can you like transplant this into places like Iraq, right? You get Saddam Hussein out. Can you build up a viable democracy? And part of the answer is it takes a long time, because you need to get not just institutions in place, but norms like rule of law and working things out through trying to attain consensus rather than just, power politics. And, it turns out that it's not unique to the West by any means, but it did arise historically in more solidified ways in, the last couple centuries, and then winds up becoming a thing in other places. And it looks like a lot of these norms can be undermined within just a matter of decades. And people can be brought to think, there's not much to this. And so we are in a different situation now, I would say, let's say post 2020 instead of 2024, right? Because the Biden administration really didn't have much to offer, and Harris didn't have much to offer as a candidate, in part because the Democratic Party doesn't have much to offer. When it's kind of funny, because I've been politically homeless for a long time. And when it was, the Clinton years and the Obama years, I was much more often criticizing them than criticizing the right, who I saw as less of a problem. Now I'm much more of a critic of the right, because they want to dominate everything all the time, and sometimes kill people, or, take their money away or healthcare away or things like that, just to be mean. That's a little facetious. But so I think we're in a time that doesn't, we're not in Weimar Republic, Germany, just before the Nazis take over. We don't have those kind of historical parallels so neat and close like that. But we are in a time when, at least in America, as opposed to, other places that are doing better, I think a lot of people have either they've stopped believing in liberal democracy as a overall framework, or their life experience shows them that it is just a sham, that it doesn't actually benefit them. Politicians talk about this sort of stuff, but it doesn't trickle down to them, or they're actively rejecting it. And because the MAGA movement is so united politically and is willing to play hardball in, incredibly like ways that totally take the opposition off step at every point. They're like, I can't believe this. Saturday Night Live actually just did a skit recently about this, where, they're trying to do a newscast, and like every 5 minutes a tweet is coming in about the next crazy thing that Trump is proposing. Well, that has a very deleterious effect on the possibility of doing the boring thing that liberalism is. And I think once the norms have been torn away, it's striking. You see people doing this, and you're like, they can't do that. Well, they did. And that means that the norms were really relying on a basis of trust, which has been eroded over recent decades. And I think you can say that some of that is happening as well in some of the European countries. It's not just US and Europe as well. You think about India and how the Congress party so screwed up that the BJP and Modi could get in and consolidate their power, but they're kind of, showing themselves to not be great either. What's going to happen after? What'll the next party system look like there? We can look at all these things. And I don't think we get to go back to the way of doing things that we had 20 years ago. Certainly not after, this chucklehead administration is like ruining our soft power everywhere, what we had of it. If we get the Canadians viewing us as potential enemies because of crazy stuff that Trump is saying, it doesn't take that long to destroy trust that requires decades or even centuries to rebuild.
Oh, I think you've nailed it on the head when you mentioned trust. I think, not to go to the full Robert Brandom spirit of trust, analytic Hegel, but people don't trust these systems anymore. There was a kind of there was a New Deal made, and it wasn't lived up to, because at least to some extent the ideological sort of appearance of the state was, we will protect you from like global shocks in the supply chain. We will subsidize a world-leading way of life. I mean, one of the things I always go back to is the kitchen debates when Nixon was VP and he went over to a World's Fair in the Soviet Union, and him and Khrushchev were arguing about who's going to have a better quality of life in their countries. Whereas I think now with Trump, it's basically, well, with Biden and Harris, it was things are great, shut up. And with Trump, it's almost like a battalion potluck, is that we can sacrifice more, we can take more hits because we are the best, we are the strongest. And people don't trust the institutional norm because the institutions, in a way, because they've forgotten in a way that they're meant to be a barrier between the people and capital, even when they're a bad one that's partially managing it, because they haven't been able to defend people against the gains of capitalists like Thiel, because they haven't wanted to, they haven't also been able to defend themselves. And in a way, it's kind of, the capital almost has a kind of immune function where it kind of gives itself so much impunity because, the less people have, the less people are going to be able to stand up to you, that now they're completely unable to tackle themselves. You think, any sort of state system that saw itself as a state and not as a manager would have defended itself against people like Thiel and Elon Musk a long time ago. I mean, even Smedley Butler, it's like the business plots. Like there was at least some sense that the state wanted to defend itself against these people, whereas now I think it's gotten, because the ideology is so tied up with these adjacent things of neoliberalism, Austrian economics that feed into this kind of Thiel style libertarianism. They more or less agree on the fundamentals at this point. It's just that these new libertarians want to go the whole way. They don't care that they own everything. They also want to be liked, and they also want to have their face on it. It is a kind of, I'm going to say narcissism, but that's not good reading of the myth of Narcissus.
Yeah, and that's an interesting feature. I mean, I've seen a lot of people joking around recently, but it's a really valid question. If MAGA's won, why are they so angry still, right? And the answer is, well, because they're invested in being angry. There's habits there that have developed, and they're still looking for more and more stuff to be angry about. And conversely, the people. So Donald Trump is another great example. Yeah, he is a narcissist, but even among narcissists, he has an incredible need to be liked and to be lauded and feared too. And you're like, what the hell is that about? It's funny too, because when Thiel mentions Hobbes in the Straussian moment, he doesn't pick up. So Hobbes has three reasons why human beings are inevitably in conflict with each other outside of the social contract in the state of nature, right? One of them is competition. The other one is what he calls diffidence, which means projecting. It's sort of strategic thinking. I know that if you want to steal my stuff, I know you want to steal my stuff because I want to steal your stuff. And so I'd better get the drop on you and do that. But he has a third thing. And this is something actually that Strauss picks up on, which Thiel doesn't. Hobbes says that the third motive is vanity, that we all want to be valued at a rate higher than we actually deserve. And this is another thing that raises the stakes for conflict. And yeah, I mean, something like Hobbesian vanity is definitely driving these people where you could be like, yeah, you won. What more do you want? You've got all the money. You get to dictate policy. You also need us to say nice things about you. What the hell's wrong with you? And, Hobbes would say something like, well, it's the working of vanity. Myself, I'd be more, tempted to say in a kind of cynical way, because they're not the masculine men they pretend to be. They're actually insecure little boys. I don't know what went wrong with their need for affirmation, but if you constantly need people to be saying nice things about you, that's pretty weird. We don't get that.
I think we're learning that the state is not a place to heal your wounds. You know, like yeah,
That's right. You know, and actually that's a great point. Like when we talk about anti-politics, beyond politics, stuff like that, there are some things that the political system is just not well designed to do, right? Now, acknowledging, so certain wounds can be at least acknowledged in the sense that we can say, you know, like when we got rid of, so big thing that conservatives are all worked up about, Fort Bragg got its name changed because we didn't want to celebrate a Confederate Civil War officer. I think that's completely right. You know, get rid of it, call it something better, or, you know, changing Mount McKinley to Denali and now trying to change it back again. But that doesn't actually heal wounds in a real way. It's a purely symbolic thing. What heals wounds partly is actually fund the programs that need to be funded and, you know, put good bureaucrats in there to make sure that things get dealt with the right way. But that's all kind of boring and tedious and time staking, right?
I'm going to sound a little bit like a pundit when I say this, but I do think it was very funny. You know, pundits like to complain that all of these Republicans and so on, they love to complain that the only thing that the government does is rename post office. They finally get their tough guy in there, and the first thing that they do is fucking rename a base. Like, meaningless bullshit. Like,
wait. What about the Gulf of America? That was that was arguably the first one.
But what's so funny is there's this desire to kind of forge this counter-revolution within the state, as if Fort Bragg wasn't named 60 years after the South had already lost the Civil War. This sort of disposition that these libertarians and they want to be, you know, rebellious and iconoclastic, but the problem is being so much a man of your age, which is what a billionaire has to be. Because you can't achieve the kind of wealth they have unless you're so imminent to your age that you can't breathe anywhere else. They also want to be iconoclastic. And that's what makes me truly sick, is that I have to watch Elon Musk not only be a billionaire, but lie that he's the best video gamer that has ever video gamed, and wield a chainsaw with that libertarian down in, you know, like the thing about this is I don't want to call them robber barons, because robber barons were strategic and knew the distance that they had to keep both from the state and from the complete and total impoverishment of the population. That in fact, the robber barons got curbed pretty quickly. And, you know, Carnegie's partners were like convinced they were going to die and burn in hell. So they built libraries all over the world. You know, the United States, we have oligarchs. We don't have an aristocracy, because an aristocracy is actually somewhat fucking educated. I'm sorry, but Elon Musk has proven that he doesn't quite ever know what he's doing. And Peter Thiel can pretend that he's the brain behind Palantir, but he's really not, because we've seen the interviews that the Palantir people do with Politico. And it's the engineers who build the cross-referencing software that kills, you know, families all over the world with drones and so on and so forth. These people they're not really aristocrats, because aristocrats understood that the world was collapsing after the First World War. Their world was collapsing, and many of them were able to pivot outside of it. These folks will collapse with the world that they've built. I really do. If this world does collapse, if the world that they've built does collapse in the sort of like world historic sense, which I don't like. I was just dunking on Hegel, and now I kind of sound like him. But like, if the world that they've built does in fact collapse, they will go with it. I don't think people like Elon Musk can survive outside of this moment in history.
One thing, however, I don't think it's correct to say that the British aristocracy is in any way educated. Bertrand Russell is the exception, not the rule. They've all still got their holdings. Most of London is still owned by the Duke of Westminster, who's like my age. These people, don't big them up. It's just an accent thing. It's just an accent.
I guess I'm just too like Donald Trump. I'm too mesmerized by French and British accents.
Well, why don't we end on one topic shift here, which is, what does the future of politics look like to you, Greg, and maybe to all of us, you know, amidst what's happening? Because at least my personal political bona fides, I mean, I see myself as a radical with strong anarchist leanings. And you know what? After reading Thiel and after reviewing my reading of Cacciari, I think I am opposed to a notion of anti-politics. I thought I was somewhat on board with it. I think I'd be more amenable. Of course, I'm more amenable to a notion of micropolitics in the Deleuzian sense, which is very different. But I think that concept can be used in its stead to describe the kinds of things that I think we need to be doing in our world to think through the problems that we face right now. Because clearly, if we try to invest ourselves in building parties, constituent power, that mode and method of uptake, I think, is just going to bring about some of the same failures that we've encountered, at least Greg, I'm not so much younger than you. You know, in my life, I've seen nothing but a downward spiral of what we've called democracy. And the question is, you know, how do we proceed with that? I mean, the way that we do it on Acid Horizon is we've created like this extensive collective, you know, through our Discord server, little meetings that we have, public events, the friendships that we've made, and the kinds of political actions that we have now taken together. We see those as essential to building the kind of world that we envision. Of course, that alone is not enough. These little globules need to connect at some point to foster a vision that's worthy of challenging the world of the New Right and of Peter Thiel. So I'm curious what you think are maybe some modest steps that we could take to seeing something different than what we have now.
Well, I don't actually have much positive to contribute.
Just going down with the ship with a salute like the rest of us.
I think that America is pretty well screwed at this point as America. I mean, we've been the dominant power for a very long time. Even during the end of the Cold War, we just kind of didn't realize it because we overplayed how tough and dangerous the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact was. And we've allowed, we're never getting our industrial base back, and the jobs that, Republicans promised to bring back, or certain Democrats promised to bring back, that's not happening. And we have a society that has incredible inequity. A lot of the, safety net and workers' protections and financial protections have just been gutted. We still don't have any answer to we are in a healthcare crisis, and we're in an environmental crisis. And I just don't think that America in our lifetime is going to get its collective shit together on a nationwide scale. I think what's going to end up happening in the short run is, we've got an ineffective Democrat Party and who, essentially is run by insiders and corporate interests and stuff like that. They even had their little retreat where they went back and they're like, yeah, too much DEI stuff, and a lot of people are like, well, that's exactly the wrong message. You're going to just like keep doing the same old thing. And then we got this crazy MAGA party, which cannot hold itself together. I mean, there's going to be a lot of people. Well, there are already a lot of people who voted for Trump who are now being hurt by it. And you can't blame the Democrats for very long unless you manage to actually like slide into a fully fascist society, which I don't think the MAGA types are smart enough to do that, frankly. So there's going to be vast disillusionment. Now, the question then is, well, what do we do? And it's, there's politics like capital P politics, and anti-politics could be something beyond or opposed to that. And it could be local stuff. And it doesn't always have to be like canvassing for your alderman or something like that. But that doesn't hurt, right? Because those are people who are more directly responsible to you and you can actually get involved with, or you could, but you could also be involved in myriad other ways that we don't think of as political, but they are lowercase p political. So, food banks, for example, right? That's, making sure that people are actually able to get food when they need it in a nation where many people go hungry. That could be political. Now, the danger is it turning into like, what would you call it? Like my little hobby, in a Voltairean sense, cultivating my little garden. Everything else is crap out here, but I'll just cultivate my garden. You don't want it to be an isolationist sort of thing. But I think there are many opportunities for solidarity of some sort. But all of this is contingent. What happens on the federal level could drastically affect that. Closing down all these income streams that were coming from the federal government has been just devastating to all sorts of local things that were dependent on federal grants. So you can do what you can do until some a-hole comes along to shut you down, I guess. But so I'm not very optimistic, but there's a difference between being pessimistic and being fatalist. I think that, so in a way, it is, somebody used the word tragic earlier. It's a tragic situation, but we still get to be actors within the tragedy and try to do something good. And it's not, even if we're, swamped later on, it doesn't mean that everything goes away.
And one thing that is more of a feeling than a thought is that with this pervasive pessimism that many people feel, it's tough to swim upstream emotionally to get to that place where we can feel the kinds of solidarity. Like maybe a day or a weekend at the food bank can sort of satisfy that desire. But I think, as you rightly point out, it puts us in that sort of Voltairean headspace. I checked the box, I did that thing for the weekend, and we're set until the next election or whatever. Whereas the kinds of work that needs to be done are bonds being formed, and a kind of counter politics with a small p, not a capital P, that manifests in the habits and communities and a form of acknowledgement of the human that we're not seeing now.
What we really need for that, without being Pollyannish, is people who are actually doing that, not tearing down other people who are actually doing that for being different in one way or another, because that's one of the problems with, I won't even say the left, I'll just say like egalitarian movements or movements that give a shit about people, is so often they're like, yeah, we're doing a good job, but those effers over there, who are also doing a good job, they're taking away resources that should be spent over here. Somehow we got to get past all of that stuff.
I will just say this. The problem does not come down to, for me, the issue is like, oh, is Elon Musk qualified to have power? Is Peter Thiel qualified to have power? The problem is like the power itself and not necessarily their qualification. I think those kinds of questions of like reinserting meritocracy, the ideological discourse surrounding it produces this. So I think ultimately like Peter Thiel has to be understood as kind of a moment and an event rather than like a singular individual with a set of notable qualities and so on and so forth. And maybe that's like not helpful way to look at it when you want to like you like there are people that you have to say like this person is doing bad, right? And it's a helpful moment to be able to isolate this person, right? Whether it's Pompidou or George Bush, de Gaulle, it doesn't matter. They're helpful in as much as they can signify a point of opposition or a point of intensity. But I think saying Palantir is doing X, Y, and Z in this country, and that ultimately we will lose the forest for the trees. And I think sometimes we run the risk of a kind of conspiratorial thinking that is not helpful, because ultimately we are the conspiracy, right? Like the everyday is the conspiracy. That's what's so terrifying. So,
I mean, in terms of, I don't know. I've recently discovered that this class struggle is really good for your mental health. Actually, there's something just really good for your mental health about quitting your job and starting a semiotic war against your own boss, which not everyone could do, to be fair. But in all seriousness, I think in terms of, as you're talking about, Greg, with the food bank example, I mean, if the government isn't going to protect us from the shocks in the global supply chain, which they are the ones playing their part collectively to do so, we are going to have to start protecting each other. And it's going to be mutual aid in the classical sense of people trying to survive amidst a hostile environment. It comes from a theory of evolution in Russia that saw it less about competition between individual people, but competitions between people who are in essentially a hostile environment where there is an abundance of resources, which we do have, but how do we share that? And I think, I'm not saying we have to go to full Kropotkin here, but I think it does end up being somewhat of a local politics, or at least a networked locality, because ultimately the power that exists only exists because of exactly, Will, the everyday networks, everyday interactions. So that makes it even harder to budge, because in a way it's too abstract. Yes, we are the workers that reproduce this entire system, and we could technically, yeah, as David Graeber says, we could just stop. We're not, because we're precarious. We need food. That's why we can't say no to bosses now, because there is no safety net. And I think, recently I was reading a really short paper. It's a 4-page review of a book by a guy called Thiel by Emanuel Wallerstein. And he says at one point that says that, look, between the years of 1848 to 1968, there was enough of a revolutionary threat that capital wanted to foot the bill for internal national kind of discontent for most people, roughly. They don't want to foot the bill anymore. And I think in that sense, we are a little bit in the sort of the pre-1848 kind of era, where capital is hasn't quite been tamed by revolution or even extinguished by revolution. And I'm not just saying that because I just finished a PhD on the young Hegelians, and we're still arguing about Hegel, so I feel like maybe there's some sort of continuity there. Who is our Feuerbach, who is our Bauer, who is our Stirner, who is our Marx? But I think, we kind of have to be the trust we want to see in the world, and we have to kind of not be afraid of people. I mean, Thiel's afraid of people. He's afraid of the demos. He abstracts it, because the only time he sees people when he's paid people, and they can't really afford to say no to him most of the time. So he knows he can't trust them, because they're all yes men. That's why they constantly need these affirmations all the time, because they have reduced everything to pure service. And as a final thing, because we are in the 500th anniversary of the German Peasants' War, you cannot be a Lutheran about this, comrades. You will not be saved by faith alone. There has to be some works involved. About faith can entail works. That's me. We kind of don't get too Calvinist about it, that some will be set for damnation, some will be set for communism. But it is also part of that very unsexy thing of just, there's a lot of work to be done. Which is, people always want to be Lenin, there's too many generals without armies.
Which is to say, like, Peter Thiel has a kind of resentment for Machiavelli, refers to him very classically as a pagan, which was the common thing to do, was not to take issue with Machiavelli's political disposition, but to take issue with his supposed atheism. So, like, Thiel is recalling back to this. Machiavelli would love Thiel's insularity and his perpetual paranoia. Machiavelli would think, like, yeah, no, that's the position of the prince, is a perpetual steadfast, like, lubricated steadfastness, where you're always at a distance from a population. Machiavelli would say, yeah, no, that's the position of the prince, is to always be ready to be at risk. So I think that again, like, figures like Thiel, they might think they're inheriting, this intellectual world of Locke and Machiavelli. They're not, they're not even a birthday cake candle in the face of the Enlightenment. I mean, like, they're a Bic lighter that's run out as I'm trying to, like, light a cigarette to impress a girl I'm talking to in, like, Manhattan in 2018. That's what they are.
Ultimately, I think the reality that they will be forced to contend with is the one which they're helping to create, which I think all of us in some way or another have pointed out here, which is the impending apocalyptic conditions. Like Greg was pointing out, we're experiencing not only the decline of America, but also its dissipation. And I think one of the imperatives for all of us amidst all of that is we need to tap into that apocalyptic spirit in a sense, or at least embrace the dissipation to the point that with the coming to pass of the illusion of the necessity or the primacy of a kind of dominant power, which will continue, in the recognition that that narrative, for Americans at least, has grown threadbare, I think that's where we find each other. And, being able to see ourselves through this kind of diaphanous veneer of the America that is coming to pass, and then also seeing within that real human beings and people who are vulnerable, and seeing that the sorts of systems that we've created are doomed, essentially. And maybe to bring it back to Adam, it's in the recognition of a kind of struggle against that, and with it simultaneously, that we see there is a kind of joy that is possible. And even though it might not bring back to us all of the treats that we've had access to over the past 40 to 50 to 60 to 100 years here in America, maybe we can find something else. That's my message of hope. But I don't know, Greg, I'm going to let you have the last word on this one.
Yeah, I think there has to be something more, right? And I sometimes take a kind of consolation in thinking about what it must have been like for Augustine of Hippo, who's, he's seeing his world fall apart. Rome gets sacked near the end of his life. And, a lot of people at the time must have been like, well, things have really been bullshit for a long time. What the hell is this crap, right? And, we're still reading him today, still thinking about him, using him as an interlocutor. The fact that America as a nation, a culture, whatever it happens to be, is not going to be around forever. That's just, a feature of history. I mean, there are some civilizations, like think about China, that have been around for millennia, but it sure as hell hasn't been the same regime the entire time, and it's drastically reworked in different times. So I mean, there's a sort of, that's very, very high level, right? Some things are going to survive that are going to be worth coming back to, but also there's that lower level of engagement with other people on contingent projects that still matter. If you help some, here in Milwaukee, we have lots and lots of problems with lead pipes still, and one of the things we've lost some of the federal money for was getting these lead pipes out of our drinking water for residents, and it tends to be concentrated in poor neighborhoods. Getting something done about that is an achievement. Even if the whole country takes a nosedive, some kid not having his brain damaged from having to drink from lead drinking water his whole life, that's an achievement. And I think we can take, we're not going to say, everything's great because we've done this, but a lot of little victories like that might be what we need.
Well, Greg, once again, it's always good to have you on the show. What is something that you're working on right now? Maybe you have new classes that are available or some coming up in the summertime.
Oh, yeah, I do have a class that's starting March 29th. It's on Platonic dialogues. We're going to go through 6 of them. And the next class after that is on Stoicism and the Cardinal Virtues. So that must be, I'm guessing, in the summer, because the Plato class goes on for 8 weeks, or maybe it's in end of May or something. So that's the kind of stuff. I'm actually working on a book project on Stoicism, the Cardinal Virtues, because it turns out to be so confusing that a lot of the proponents today are getting it wrong. And so, it seems kind of antiquarian, but it actually has a lot of relevance to living a decent life today.
I almost never plug our stuff in the context of the episode. I usually record it afterwards, but I'll say now, of course, we always have ongoing reading groups. We have the Hegel reading group. We have the Anti-Oedipus Files, Klosowski reading group, a Foucault reading group. Will is going to have a reading group on the politics of friendship coming up, which is going to be a good one. But Acid Horizon is also going to do its first class this year at the new Center for Research and Practice. And maybe you saw something about it online. The tentative title, and it will probably be the permanent title, is The Philosophy of Assassination, the Assassination of Philosophy. And there's going to be a lot of different things happening in there. We're going to look at the historical Hashashin and their ideologies and the history connected to it. And we're going to trace some sort of transversal line all the way through to the ways in which philosophy has been assassinated. And I'll say, we're looking at starting our own imprint this year. I wonder if there will be a Sadler contribution to the Acid Horizon imprint at some point in the future. But yeah, we have a few friends and speculative submissions just kind of percolating off to the side. And we're going to see if you're an investor and you're listening to this, and you are absolutely not an evil person, but somehow you have money, the time, and the largesse to support Acid Horizon, reach out to us and we will run a background check on you. And then thank you for contributing to the establishment of our publishing imprint. And with that said, thank you everyone for listening. We'll catch you next time.